I'm happy to see more and more requests come in asking for specific things dealing with watercolor. And here's one asking for a quick tip on tonal values of watercolor. Similar to oil in some ways and totally different from oil in others. First of all, when we use the term tonal values, we're simply talking about the value range of any color, not just watercolor. When you look at the tubes, or the color as it comes out of the tubes of watercolor and oils, they look very much the same. But when you're actually working with those colors, you're dealing with something a little bit different. Now, I'm going to show you just a few of the colors, and then you can do your own experiment if you're really interested in watercolor, or if you're already into watercolor and you really want to know what to expect from the value range of every color you have. You can then do this experiment with all of your colors and find out. So I'm going to use just for this first section here, I'm just going to use Antwerp blue. And the reason I'm doing that is because you see on the palette, Antwerp blue looks like a very, very dark color, and it is. It does have an inherent value of very, very dark. But then when we put it on the palette, we'll see that it has a really wide range, wide possibility of ranges, of value ranges. Now, that possibility changes from when you put the paint on dry paper and when you put the paint on wet paper. Now that's the difference, a major difference between how we work with watercolor and how we work with oil. So let's start out, let's wet the paper first. Now the one thing about watercolor is when you start working with the water, you have to keep going and keep an eye on the degree of wetness, because the degree of wetness will determine the value. And as it dries, you may think you have a color really dark and you have it pretty wet, and as that dries it's going to get lighter and lighter. So we have some things to control with watercolor. It makes it really a lot of fun, but in some ways kind of challenging. So we'll start out, and I'm just going to put clear water, an area of clear water. Well, it's not really that clear. Well, it doesn't make that difference. So I had a little paint in the brush. Here we go. Just put an area of water, and I'm going to put it in kind of a band here so that you can see. And this is what we would call wet. Now, you might think, well, that's obvious it is wet. Well, we have these terms in watercolor. When it's wet, really wet, we see this gloss on there, and we'll get a different result than we'll get if the water has evaporated somewhat and we still have it damp. So you see, I'm still adding water to it as I talk, because I know that that water is evaporating, and I can see in front of, I can see when I turn my head in certain ways, I can see a gloss there. Now, I'm going to load the brush and take the water out of the brush. I'm going to load the brush with as dark a Antwerp blue as I can get in the brush, and I'm going to start it right here. And watch what happens when I put it down. You see how much lighter it goes when I put it in wet that's called. See how much lighter it goes. I could keep adding to that. But because it's so wet, you'll see now it goes a little bit darker, but even that's going to dry lighter. So, perhaps it will dry lighter while we're doing this quick tip, and you can see it. Now you can see a gradation that takes place because of the ability of the watercolor to bleed, which oil doesn't do, and which acrylic doesn't do if you're working with it as a thick paint. So we have this range right here already. As it bleeds into the water, we have a little bit of a value range. Now watch what happens here. As I continue, I haven't reloaded the brush. As I continue to move this brush in this wet paper, we can see that the value gets a little bit lighter and a little bit lighter and a little bit lighter as I go out. Now I've reached a point where it's dry paper. Now if I put a stroke of that same brush load of paint right beside the wet paper and the dry paper, you can see what a difference we have in value. So when we're talking about the tonal values of watercolor, we have to consider those values when we're working with it, we have to consider those values as to what will happen if we put them on dry paper or if we put them on wet paper. Now we can, by adding more water, as I have said in other watercolor quick tips, by adding more water we can get lighter values. So I added a little bit more water here. Alright, there we go. There's a lighter value. I can add a little bit more water, and I like to add the water to the palette first so I can kind of see what the value is. You can tell that on the palette by just looking at the difference between this value and that value, and you can see there it is. There is the lighter value of Antwerp blue. Now the tonal range is between here and not here, but I'm now going to put the darkest mixture of Antwerp blue, the darkest mixture I can get with, and I'm going to talk about that just a second. I'm going to put this dark mixture right here on dry. Now you see the difference? How much darker this is on wet on dry than when I put that same degree of paint in the brush wet on wet. So that's what you have to consider. Now here's what I wanted to talk about. When you're trying to get the darkest version of watercolor, if you don't add a little bit of water, we call that activating. We activate the color because it's very pasty. You can see that right here. I'm going to pull it on the palette. And can you see how it's very pasty when it doesn't have the water added to it? That is not going to dry. If you put that directly on the paper like this, that's not going to dry. It's going to remain sticky. It's not a good thing to do. So you've got to have that paint a little bit activated so that the pasty part of it goes away. Now you can get that Antwerp blue pretty dark, by controlling the activation. Now here it is activated. You see it on the palette. You can see as I pull a little water into it, it becomes more liquid, and it only works as a watercolor paint that is going to dry when you activate it. So that is about as dark. Let me get that wet on. There we go, right there. That is about as dark as you're going to get with a viable paint when you're working with the Antwerp blue or any of the very, very dark colors wet on dry. If you want the color darker, if you want an Antwerp blue that's darker, taking it out thick like that is no good. That's, as I said before, it's going to stay pasty. It's going to stick to everything, and eventually part of it is going to flake off. So if you want that darker, you've got to go with another color to darken it. And this is a nice clue. Now this goes a little bit beyond what the viewer requested. But what we've discovered is, looking at the hue name of what we know of the physics of color, this Antwerp blue is really a blue that leans a little bit towards green, which means it's a little warmer blue because green has yellow in it. Don't anybody argue about that. It's in another quick tip. So if we want that to be really darker, and I don't know why you really would want it much darker than that, but if you do, you would go to its complement. Now, one complement that will do that is a combination of a red orange. We'll have to put right here. Try to get that a dark version of red orange. Now if I put that red orange or this orange in there by itself, it's going to turn it green. So I need to add a little bit of purple back to it. So I'll go into my purple mixture over here and create a very, very dark. There we go. Look at that, just very, very dark. Now you can see how very, very dark that is. It's almost a black. All right. Now if we take that, activate it, and add a touch of that into the Antwerp activated, you can still keep the Antwerp leaning towards blue. Here it is right here, but you see you can make it darker. So if you want your tonal range to be from the darkest dark possible to the lightest light possible, this is the darkest dark possible you can get with the Antwerp blue. I think I said ultramarine, but anyway, I meant Antwerp. But in order to get it darker than that, you've got to add warmer colors back into it. In this case, a good mixture would be that the purple and the orange. It creates a neutrality that enables that to go darker. Now, looking at your colors in your palette, the same thing will be true of all the colors that are really, really dark. Some of those appear darker in the palette than you can make them here. For one example of that, well, people are going to have different colors on their palette, but the sap green is one example of that. It looks darker on the palette. So if this is the Daniel Smith sap green, which is the one I prefer. But see, if I get the sap green activated, and I'm going to put it wet on dry on the palette, you see the yellow in the sap green, once it dries, the yellow in sap green makes it feel a little lighter. And then if you put that on wet, let's get a little bit of wet here. I'll show you this. I'll just wet it. You put a really, really dark, I'll get it activated again and get it as dark as I can get it on the brush. And you see how much lighter it wants to go. So, the moral of that, I guess you could say, for the full value range of any of those darker colors, you're going to need to use the drier paper, wet on dry for the darkest part, and then if you want a full range, if you want the colors to be wet in wet, you can get that full range of the dark as it appears right here it would be on over to the lighter light there. Now that has to do with the dark colors. You can do your own experiments and you can find that out. Alizarin crimson is another one that looks really, really dark as it comes out of the tube. But let's do a little bit of an experiment with alizarin to show you. The thing is, you get to know each of these colors that you work with, get to know how they behave in value as you're working with them. And then when you start mixing them together, you have a little bit better idea of how they behave when they're put into mixtures. So we'll do just a little bit of demonstration now with the alizarin crimson. And again, I'm going to start about right here and do a band of wet in wet. Now I'll go to the alizarin. This is the alizarin permanent I'm using. So I'll go right in there. Now you can see in my palette how very dark it looks. Now I'm going to get it as activated as I can. Right here. And you can see when I bring it out on the palette, as activated as I can get it. And I'll bring it over here. You see how much lighter it looks. And then that's the wet on wet, and if I put it on the wet on dry, you see it's still, and it's going to dry much lighter. Now you can compare in the palette. This looks or appears maybe might lead you to think it's a much darker color, or very close. It does look a little lighter than the Antwerp does, but it might mislead you to think it's much darker than it really is. But when you put it on the paper, you put it on wet on dry, it gets a little lighter. Now you can compare this to this. You can see there's a value difference. And then as this dries, it's going to get lighter and lighter. Again, you can do the same experiment that I did there by just taking a brush load. Let me reload the brush here. By just taking a brush load, and as long as this is wet, I can see it's already drying. So that's the thing you fight with watercolor, and especially under all of our lights here. It's drying much faster than normal, so you just have to keep an eye on it. And that's another thing too. There's some areas you might live in that are more arid than other areas, where you're going to find that it dries at varying degrees depending on the atmosphere. We can see that. Now, as that gets lighter, there you can see this the extension of the value of the alizarin is longer than the extension of the Antwerp, and that's because it's a stronger tinting strength. So that means it's going to require more water in comparison to get that full range, and so we can do that right here, just to pull that full range of value from the lightest light here to the darkest dark there. Now you have some colors that you can't get a full value range from. The yellows are obvious. You can't get that full range of values from the yellows. So if I go to, cadmium yellow, I've just got a plain cadmium yellow here. Cadmium yellow light, I believe that is there. And you can see, I'll just put this down wet on. You see they're very light color. So what do you do if you want a darker yellow? Well, you need to add something to it. And that's the thing about all colors. The ones that are the lighter colors in their inherent value, if you want them darker, you've got to add something to them. What causes a color to go darker? If the local color of the thing is yellow and it has darker on it, it's going darker because it's been thrown into shadow. In that case, adding its complement is your best bet to get it darker. So let's just try that little experiment, and then we'll see that we can extend the value range just a little bit. If we go, the complement of yellow is purple. Now here's the kicker on that one. If we add dark purple as it comes out of the tray right here into that yellow, it's going to change it way too much. So if we want it gradually darker, we first of all will adjust its value, and we do that with water. So I'll just take a little bit of purple here, lay it down about right there, and add the water to it. Get it lighter by adding water. Always get it lighter by adding water, unless you're doing something special like I did in an earlier quick tip where I was using white as a functional tool for causing fog, but not in this case. Alright, so now pick that up. Now watch what happens. It changes and causes that yellow to get a little bit darker. So there we are right there. Causes that yellow to behave as if it's going into shadow. Now yellow loses its characteristic. It doesn't stay yellow as it moves into shadow. It always turns towards another color. So it's either going to go a little bit more towards green, it's going to go a little bit more towards red as it gets darker. But you'll find those things. The main thing is that the extension of the tonal value of yellow is very short. Now I'll show you. Let's do this wet on wet right here. What I mean by this extension. It starts out as a very light color to begin with. Right here, this is wet on wet. It starts out as a very light color, and it's not going to get much lighter. See, as it moves into the more water here, we get that very, very narrow range. So you might say the tonal range of the yellows is very narrow. The tonal value range of yellows is very narrow. Most of the yellows, as we identify them as yellows, are going to be pretty bright. There are some, like the quinacridone gold, for example, right here. It looks very, very dark as it comes out of the tube, but then when you activate it and put it wet on dry right here, you see it's just a little bit darker than middle value, and of course it's going to dry much lighter than that. Then let's see, the range of that one, the value range of that one is very narrow. With that a little bit more right here. There we go. See there, the value range of the quinacridone gold is very narrow as compared to the red or as compared to the blue. Now, so you can look at, you can pretty much pick and choose as you move along the palette. You can sort of tell when you look at the colors what their value range is going to be, or tonal range is going to be, but you really don't know until you give them the test. And the best way to test them is wet on wet and wet on dry. Now you can see this is drying now, and the drier it gets, even when we finish this quick tip, it's going to get even drier. But you see the values get lighter as it gets dry. And you see this dark right here that we thought was so dark? Compared to this dark I put on there as kind of a paste coming out of the tube. See how much lighter it is? And then you can see here that where I had added the a complementary set to that, the dark remains dark. So that's a good, you might call it a scientific way to think about watercolor, that with oils or with acrylics, Your whites and the lighter colors are going to control the values. They're going to just sit there and they're not going to change very much at all as they dry. With watercolor, you've got that full range. Whatever happens, put the color down. It depends upon how wet the paper is as to how dark it's going to remain. In the lighter areas, they're pretty much going to stay in the same value. So it's a good idea if you really want to work with watercolor, and it is an exciting medium to work in. But if you really want to work in watercolor, first of all, explore the tonal range or the value range of each color you're working with, and then you'll know what you're doing. And don't forget, explore it both wet on wet and wet on dry. Be sure to view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to dyingminds.com where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.